just looking at what the pipeline looks like for rail investment over the next 15 years is significant, with a record amount of $155 billion planned. The expenditure by jurisdictional governments accounts for a significant portion of that. And so, and there's also some complementary work happening with the National Rail Action Plan, very much looking at reforms that could assist in this space as well. And so it's a good time to be looking at this issue. I'll hand over to you, Naidhruv.
Yep. Thanks for that, Phil. Yeah, so I can start off by doing a bit of scene setting for the current state of local government policies in Australia. So the big question, what are local content policies? They're normally policies that set out conditions that stipulate how much of a project or procurement needs to be sourced from a domestic source. And these LCPs can sort of be applied to a variety of variables. They could either be applied to the manufacture of a product that's being procured. So how much of the product is manufactured domestically or assembled locally. It could also apply to raw materials that are used in the production of the product that's being procured. How much of those raw materials are sourced from the locality that the project is based in, and it can also sort of be focused on the human resources that are used in the project. So how much of the workforce that's working on the project is boots on the ground as opposed to people being floated from other states or internationally. So that's kind of what the variables that LCPs sort of apply to. With regards to objectives, typically LCP's objectives are mostly focused on creating some sort of economic value. The most obvious one is through creating jobs. LCPs could also aim to sort of provide opportunities for disenfranchised or minority groups, and in some cases, if, for example, a government is trying to champion a particular industry, or there's some sort of a strategic sort of potential for a specific industry, in that case, LCPs can also be used to sort of promote that industry. With regards to how they work, it's a high level, sort of pretty straightforward. The theory is that an increase in the use of domestic factors of production could lead to economic benefits through more jobs, which in turn create more local income, which in turn creates more consumer spending, and so on and so forth. So with regards to the current sort of state of LCPs in Australia, there are a wide variety of them that are currently in place. There's been very little work that's been done to evaluate these LCPs or to see how effective they are in achieving their objectives and their aims. And so when we took on this project, we sort of started off by sort of identifying what these policies are that are currently in place. And we sort of started looking at, what are some of the common characteristics and and alternatively, how they differ from each other. So yeah, I think the next slide we can talk a bit about that. So this provides a bit of a snapshot of all the LCPs that are currently in place. You can see there's quite a few in Australia, and this does not even consider some of the federal policies, such as the ANZ GPA or the Australian Jobs Act or the Australian Industry Participation National Framework, which are more of a federal sort of federal policies. So some of these policies are very rail procurement focused. So if you look at Victoria's trains, trams, jobs 2015-2025, it's a plan that's solely focused on rail, but some of them are also kind of encompass a more broader sort of procurement activities. So it could be rail construction. An example of this is the South Australian Industry Participation Policy. Now, these policies have a bunch of similar characteristics, but some of the issues that come up are the way that they're applied, which is quite inconsistent across the various states. So as mentioned before, some of the similar sort of aspects of these policies are the objectives. You know, there's some pretty repetitive sort of objectives that a lot of these policies aim to achieve, which include, you know, new jobs, opportunities for local businesses. Some of them look at skill development, where they ensure that part of the workforce is comprises of trainees or cadets. And then, you know, they're also linked to some other economic and social policies that the states have. There are also some commonalities in the sort of deliverables that these policies normally ask for. So when someone is putting in, when a supplier is putting in a tender, they normally ask for some sort of an industry development plan or a local participation plan. Sometimes they ask for benefit statements. So that is quite common across all policies. You know, so just some sort of paperwork that shows a commitment to helping the local sort of community. But that it really is where the sort of similarities end. If you look at the bulk of the policy, which is the actual requirements, those are quite inconsistent and different across the various states. If you look at, for example, within requirements, if we think about the actual thresholds at which these policies come into play. So this is the idea that the LCPs are only applied to projects that reach a particular threshold in value. In Victoria, for example, it's all projects that are greater than $50 million have to comply with these mandatory LCPs. This is cut down by half in Western Australia, where you know, the threshold for projects that have to sort of comply with these additional local content requirements is at $25 million, or projects that are higher than that. This is again different in New South Wales, where for all projects that reach to about $3 million, government entities have to first procure from small and medium-sized enterprises. And again, different in Queensland, where there is a bit of a consideration of geographic sort of characteristics, where the government procurer has to look at or has to emphasize local content in regional areas for all projects that are valued at higher than $100 million. So yeah, so just for that one very specific variable, which is the threshold level, it's, you know, quite different from state to state. There's also a lot of variation in the actual evaluation of the local content commitments. So, you know, some states focus on skill development. For example, in Victoria, you know, 10% of any project that's greater than $20 million has the workforce. 10% of the workforce has to comprise of cadets or trainees. Other states don't really, or some other states don't really look at the skill development sort of aspect. Then there's also varying weightings and requirements associated with Indigenous participation across the different states. Sometimes the actual weighting of local content also varies from state to state. So for example, in New South Wales, at least 10% of all non-price criteria is allocated to SME participation. In South Australia, it's about 20%. And then there's also evaluation bodies that come to play in some states, where, you know, some states, like for South Australia, have a government advocate for local content that helps with, you know, meeting these local content requirements for both suppliers and also procurers. The Industry Capability Network, ICN, does a similar role in Victoria. We've detailed a lot of these policies in the report, where, you know, there's a lot to read about the various weightings and requirements and evaluation criteria that are used. But all of this is to say that there is, you know, significant variation in state-based local content and how they're applied within the Australian jurisdictions. And this variation can sometimes lead to significant issues within industry, which we can talk about in the next slide. So if you combine the fragmented nature of LCPs in Australia with the fact that the rail industry or market in Australia is quite small comparatively. And also the fact that the procurement pipeline is quite cyclical, it can be a bit lumpy. All these sort of variables put together a perfect storm where there are a lot of significant inefficiencies being created. One of the examples that's kind of emblematic of this inefficiency is the example of duplicated capital investments, where, for example, if a bidder wants to sort of bid in 3 different states, in order to meet the conditions that are required by the 3 different states LCPs, he has to, or they have to, build facilities, 3 different facilities in these states, which is very expensive. It's a waste of money, and it's cash that can be used for other purposes, such as research and development. So it basically makes bidding in multiple states quite unviable. And it's this sort of restrictive nature of the policies that sometimes create these small pockets of procurement, like state-based procurement, which further shrinks an already small, rail market or rail industry, which in turn leads to higher price premiums, it dilutes value for money, and overall has a bit of an adverse impact on competitiveness. And so to counteract this, it's proposed that a national a more harmonized approach towards a more national local content policy that includes things like standardizing definition of local content, coordination between the states on requirements and evaluation criteria, things like that, could allow for a consolidation of a larger centralized market. As opposed to the many small state-based ones that we currently have, which could then, theoretically lead to greater competition, because a lot more firms are, able to bid for multiple projects in multiple different states, which in turn could lower costs, improve quality of work. And just generally provide more capital for investment opportunities and research and development and all that good stuff. So this kind of includes a high-level narrative of the current state of LCPs in Australia. And in building this narrative, stakeholder consultation was critical. As Phil mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, it really was crucial. The feedback we got from them really was crucial in helping us build this narrative. So we'll now go over some of the issues that were identified and some of the feedback that was received by the stakeholders. Good. Thank you. So as part of this exercise, we spoke with about 30 organizations in the rail industry, not just within industry and suppliers, but also procuring agencies, statutory bodies, rail operators. And through this process, we sort of identified a wide range of challenges that are currently being faced. So for this presentation, we've sort of split them up into 2, where we're looking at feedback from industry and feedback from jurisdictions sort of separately. So we can tackle industry first. So the first sort of main feedback we got from industry was that requirements and tender documents can be difficult to understand. So it was reported that it is often difficult to understand and comply with the required sort of percentages and methodologies that are used to actually calculate this local content. And this is often made more challenging by the inconsistencies between the methodologies of the different states. Sometimes there might also be a focus on key components, often resulting in some other components or inputs such as design not being considered, which is apparently a thing that happens quite often. Then there's also, then the second sort of main finding from industry was that local content is sometimes not exactly local. So the way, it's been reported that the way that local content is, or the requirements are stipulated and sort of measured through percentage amounts is could be considered narrow or an imperfect measure of the actual state-based content that is included within the procurement. For example, in some jurisdictions, local content could be satisfied through importing rail components and then assembling them domestically, with very little regard to the actual sort of source of these components. Similarly, it was also reported that some Australian-based organizations are actually owned by overseas entities, which can lead to some confusion or sort of wariness regarding how much of this content is actually local and exactly which of the communities is it actually benefiting. Then the third sort of main finding from industry is that focus in jobs can sometimes have contrary impact. So across the board, all industry participants sort of recognize that the importance of creating jobs and the importance of LCPs sort of mandating that a bunch of jobs have to be created locally. But there was also a sort of opinion that for the sort of creation of jobs for a particular project in a particular location could sometimes create duplication or inefficiencies. So we received a lot of feedback on how it was quite difficult to relocate staff to particular locations or to create or build skill and knowledge bases in locations where it didn't previously exist, particularly with the current skill shortages that Australia is dealing with. Another issue is that due to the cyclical or lumpy nature of Australian rail procurement, the costs associated with establishing a local presence have a shorter sort of lifespan to amortize or to recoup, and so any jobs that are created tend to be quite short term, and once the project is completed, these jobs are often unviable to maintain. So the fourth main sort of finding from industry was that local content requirements can compromise project resources. And so the actual complexity in understanding the arrangements that are required or like the local content requirements that are needed for various jurisdictions within a tender team is quite expensive. And so this kind of adds complexity and costs to the bidding teams, and the costs are often sort of recouped over time within the tender price. The next sort of main finding is that the tender process is not always as transparent, partially as a result of the difficulty in completing and complying with local content requirements. Respondents often feel that current LCPs can reduce market competition. This is particularly in those states that have a very prescriptive local content requirement, where firms have felt that with existing presence, or firms that have felt that the firms that have existing presence have an unassailable advantage, and this can lead to sometimes a decision by some firms to not actually bid on particular projects, impacting the range and availability of skills and resulting in issues with competition. And then the last sort of main feedback from industry is that there are limited opportunities for specialist entrants. So in the current state, there are certain specialist parts that are typically not manufactured in Australia and are usually procured overseas. Having said that, if there is an opportunity for the components to be made in Australia, it is often sort of difficult to identify a local manufacturer or supplier that has the required sort of capacity and skills. So now we can kind of switch to some of the feedback that we received from jurisdictions. So there is the jurisdictions whom we've spoken to have definitely sort of recognized that there is a need for greater harmonization with regards to LCPs, and they seem to be aware of the issues that can be experienced by industry and suppliers. Having said that, it is also sort of reported that political realities and political objectives that can be achieved through these LCPs present a significant barrier for reform or coordination. So let's go to the next one then. Next slide. So as part of the reporting on stakeholder findings, we also created a series of case studies that we developed using some real life circumstances experienced by the stakeholders. The first case study kind of looks at what local content really means when bidding for tenders, and the struggles for bidders to know exactly what extent of their product is actually considered local. So this case study kind of looked at a supplier who locally designs and manufactures various parts that require certain sort of imported subcomponents, but kept losing out to bigger firms who almost entirely imported all the components for their products, but assembled them domestically. So this limited sort of definition of local content resulted in restricted competition within the market. And the perception of gaming by some of the participants in local content requirements. Another case study that we did looked at how a firm was unable to bid for a specific project because they did not have a physical presence in the state, and doing so would be unviable for the business. And the process of bidding on this project was so cost prohibitive for many of the participants that a lot of them did not even bid for the project. A third case study looks at how a recent increase in local content requirements has led to significant resourcing issues, and providing the most suitable team to fulfill the project and respond to the tender in a manner that adheres to timelines. And finally, we also have a fourth case study that looks at how an established manufacturing facility that was known for its capabilities is now unable to respond to tenders because, or respond to tenders unable to respond to tenders outside the state that they're located in, because the response from the procurement entity is that delivery from an out-of-state supplier is equivalent to delivery from an international sort of supplier. So these case studies sort of aim to highlight the inefficiencies that are being caused by the current state of LCPs, and that there are significant benefits to be gained through an adoption of a national approach. So we also looked at the potential for benefits that could be achieved through simplifying some of the bidding sort of processes. And so the potential benefits that we primarily looked at were related to a reduction in complexity for potential bidders and a reduction in bid price for jurisdictions through increased market competition. So because data was quite hard to get through because of commercial and confidentiality issues, and just a general lack of available data, we kind of looked at 4 existing projects that we use as case studies to demonstrate a potential sort of range of cost savings that can be associated with reduced bid complexity. And so the 4 projects we picked were the Queensland train manufacturing program and the Victoria high capacity metro trains, the Western Australian C series electric trains, and the New South Wales regional rail trains. And we picked these projects because the projects of various sizes and they're expected to have a variety of impacts on their local communities. And through some desktop research, we sort of determined that a reduced bid cost can result in lower costs and improved products for procuring entities in various ways. For example, through enabling an increase in the number of entities that can bid for projects, bidders are allowed to develop better quality bids, or reduce profit margins. In this analysis, we've assumed that the reduced bid complexity directly corresponds to reduced bid costs. And so through some research, we determined that an assumption that bidding costs constitutes about 0.65% of total project value of the winning bidder. And using this assumption, we calculated a series of scenarios for these 4 projects. And what we found was that even with a 5% reduction in bid costs, which is associated with a reduction in bid complexity, the potential savings for each of these procurement processes could be quite substantial. For these particular projects, the savings ranged from between $500,000 to $2.3 million. Again, more detailed this analysis is available in the report. But I'll now pass on to Phil to talk about how some of these benefits can be achieved and how these inefficiencies can be counteracted through reform.
Thanks, Naidhruv. So, look, at the outset, we recognise the realities of being in a federation. Most people in our firm have worked for state government at some point in their careers, so we get the realities of what state governments need to deal with regards to major projects. And so we wanted to be pragmatic, really, and look at, okay, well, we've got this aim of a more national policy, but that's not going to happen necessarily overnight. I mean, what's the pathway towards a more harmonised set of policies look like, and what steps could be taken? So our recommendations focused heavily on what could you do to start to move and change the approach so that in a way that can demonstrate the benefits to jurisdictions and procuring entities so that they can get the confidence to keep proceeding with reforms and harmonisation. So this is very high level, but in terms of what we're trying to get out of a national local content policy, key aim should be to enable or develop a longer term and more strategic view of what the benefits of local content are in rail projects. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. Secondly, to increase the transparency and simplicity for the rail industry, and as part of that, promoting confidence and facilitating or enabling greater investment. And thirdly, to continually improve the commercial framework that's applied to rail procurement so that it can continue to provide more benefits to the procuring entities. So that's very high level, but what's that look like? We'll just unpack that a little bit more. So we identified 7 focus areas for reform, and in the interest of time, I won't go through all of those today, but we'll cover a sample of them. All the details in the report. But for each one, what we've done is to look at, okay, what should be the goal of a national policy? What's the long-term outcome that we're trying to achieve by moving towards or implementing a national policy? But secondly, what are the shorter-term benefits and the shorter-term steps look like with respect to these things to start to move you towards that point? So covering a sample of these, firstly, the definition of local content, as Naidhruv's talked about, is a really important issue because at the moment there are various definitions of local content applied in policy, both defined and applied, while the Australian and national New Zealand procurement agreement provides quite a clear definition of what local content is, which is any content from Australia or New Zealand. That's not the way in practice that local content is applied through a variety of state government procuring entities. And so, yes, the end goal is to recognise national content as being equivalent to state-based content. So to adopt that definition. But if that can't be done quickly, then perhaps there's an option, in a pathway recommendation is to take a phased approach whereby, for example, components with a high potential for harmonisation, the NTC is doing some work looking at this at the moment. And perhaps for these components, states, jurisdictional entities could be ambivalent about where they're produced, as long as they're produced in Australia or New Zealand, and so not taking that state-based view. Another option may be to actually split out. It's potentially complicated, but to split out the amount of local content desired from a state perspective versus from a national perspective, and where jurisdictions do favour or want to favour local content produced in their own state, it would be ideally that would be linked to the objectives they have, specific objectives they have to build manufacturing or specific capabilities within their own states, and ideally in published plans, so that gives a greater degree of certainty to industry to understand what they're trying to do with that policy. The other thing that we think really needs to be looked at in the short term is around the duration of benefits from local content. So the end state ideally would be procurement practices that incentivise multiple forms of local content. And so an example of how this could be done in a transitional sense would be to look at, the weighting that's given to different forms of local content policy. For example, local content related to whole of life support for assets might be weighted more highly than short-term labour force participation, which can dissipate quite quickly, and in some cases is related to building facilities themselves, or perhaps assembly of trains and other rail equipment from components that are ultimately made overseas. So a more nuanced approach could have a big impact. What we've termed geographic scope is really looking at how jurisdictions work with each other. We want the high-level goal of harmonisation of policy across states and territories, but in the shorter term, bilateral approaches could have a big impact. So we've done some work recently looking at the demand for certain rail components across Australia, and that work identified that the vast majority of demand comes from New South Wales and Victoria for those particular things that we looked at. And so maybe as a first step, greater cooperation between those two states with respect to procurement and local content policy could have a big impact. And just the information sharing across jurisdictions is really important too. In the short term, I think to get better alignment and better information, work could be done to look strategic assessment of market opportunities, the natural strengths of local content input from different jurisdictions, so that industry are a bit clearer about what governments are trying to achieve and they can work better within that. Another issue that came up a lot in the course of our work was the involvement of the Commonwealth and federal involvement. So most stakeholders agreed that the federal government can play a critical role in this space. There was sometimes some conjecture about exactly what that role should be, but if you look at at the moment, at the federal level, there's forums in place that can be used to bring people together. More effective use of the Australian Australia and New Zealand government procurement frame agreement as the basis for state and territory policies. And more challenging, but certainly something that could be looked at, would be where it can, for the Commonwealth to dictate requirements for projects that have federal funding. That's challenging because historically the Commonwealth hasn't funded rolling stock projects, which are a key focus for those jurisdictional policies. But all things that could be looked at, and certainly we think that there's a really important role that the federal government needs to play in sponsoring reforms, because unless there's a recognition at that level, then I think achieving any change is, in the long term, is likely to be a challenge. We also looked at evaluation, in particular, how is local content considered in those procurement processes? And I think, as Naidhruv's mentioned, that the view of local content is often quite narrow in terms of employment and headline statements about jobs, but there's an opportunity to really look at the other benefits that come from local content, including social and environmental outcomes. And these things, from our review, don't appear to be considered in any detail through those procurement processes that we understand. So our report goes into a lot more detail about some of those things that can be done. And I should say too that we recognise that some of the ideas that we have are likely to be easier than others to implement. And some things may not be viable. Ultimately, those things need to be prioritised, and that should be done with jurisdictions. What we've tried to do is put together a comprehensive set of ideas that could provide a starting point for policymakers to then go and develop reforms further and prioritise those according to ministerial needs. We looked at some transitional issues and implementation considerations, and the key elements that we think need to be in place are, unsurprisingly, sponsorship at a ministerial level, having a forum in place to facilitate coordination, and having a body in place to actually lead work and do that coordination. So we think that the Federal Minister for Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Local Governments is well positioned to lead, to champion this reform through the ITEM Forum. And ideally, local content policy reform would be an item, a standing item on that agenda. There are already sufficient forums, governance forums, and in place to develop reforms further. We think that certainly the arrangements that set up for the National Rail Action Plan could be expanded to encompass local content policy reform, and maybe another group set up within that. And the National Transport Commission, given all the work that it's doing on the National Rail Action Plan and related projects, looks to us like in a good position to play a key role in all of this, but they would need to be supported and funded to do that. And one of the ideas that we've got is the establishment of an industry advocate who could play a role within an existing government organisation like the NTC to champion reforms and progress some of these near-term changes. So we've essentially provided just two main recommendations in our work. Firstly, to look at or make some short-term changes to the way that tender requirements are set and making that more consistent across jurisdictions. And so picking out some of those things that I just talked about around the definition of local content and how the duration of benefits is considered through the assessment process, better definitions or more holistic definitions of value for money. And something I haven't talked about now, but it's in our report, is some thoughts about compliance through the tendering process and how that could be used to better incentivise consistent local content provision. The second main recommendation is around appointing a person, we've called it an independent rail advisor, industry advisor, who could champion these reforms, but start to lead some of that work that needs to be done to bring jurisdictions together and actually starting to develop some of those reforms further. As you can see from this slide, there's a long list of things that sort of advisor could do. The advisor, I guess, has some similarities with the proposal of the new government to establish a rail supplier advocate as part of the National Rail Manufacturing Plan. but we're thinking that this role would have a broader focus and involve a more collaborative approach with government. There are a lot of things that could be done, but ultimately these need to be prioritised by jurisdictions. So, look, that's a pretty quick run through of the report. I hope that's a useful summary, and we hope that this helps the process ahead. And I'll throw it back to you, Natalie, for the leaders in the Q&A.
Thanks so much, Phil and Naidhruv. That was a really helpful overview. If I could also invite Barry and Christine back on screen. So Christine Atkins is the director at NineSquared and Barry Lovett is the associate. And it sounds like, Barry, you'll be answering all the questions that we'll get through based on Phil's comments earlier. Just a reminder to participants, I encourage you to submit questions. You can do that through the question pane on the side panel there, and I will throw to the NineSquared team to answer if you have some specific comments on the findings of the report and recommendations. We'd be happy to hear them too, so don't be shy. But perhaps while we're waiting for those questions to come through, I might kick off. You talked a lot about the importance of collaboration by the jurisdictions. And I guess based on your engagement with the jurisdictions, what do you think their appetite is to coordinate? Who wants to answer that one?
Thanks, Natalie. I'm happy to kick that one off. It was certainly an issue that we thought about a lot during the project and came up a lot in conversation. I think many of the jurisdictions that we spoke to appreciate the need for change, but are constrained in doing that. And Christine, I know that you're involved in stakeholder engagement. This came up a lot. Did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty accurate, Phil. I think a lot of the jurisdictions could see the benefits from a theoretical perspective, from a policy perspective, but we're well aware of the need for political impetus and political will to drive that process forward. So I guess, yeah, it was one of those things that looks good on paper, but also needs some support from the people that make the decisions and the people that appear in front of the media to get that moving.
And you mentioned benefits there, Christine. So can all jurisdictions benefit from a national approach to local content?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's reasonable to say that there is the potential for all jurisdictions to experience some of those benefits, take a broader view of what a benefit is, looking at, like, there's a lot of focus on jobs, but a lot of what we talked about with them and in our research afterwards was that a job is not necessarily, a job is not a job is not a job. Like, is a short-term job as beneficial as a longer-term job? Are 1,000 short-term jobs as beneficial as 500 long-term jobs? Those kinds of things. So I think that the jurisdictions could benefit from looking at a broader perspective and thinking about, rather than the sound bites to go to the media, what are the things that will really make a difference to their economies in the longer term.
And you spoke about incentivisation there before. So what is the role of the federal government in supporting this coordination?
Yeah,
Who wants to take that?
To answer that one, Natalie. Yeah, I think that they need to play a critical role in this because the decision makers at a jurisdictional level are constrained by the political realities that they work in. And so without really the Commonwealth championing this as an area where reform is needed, I think there's not a lot of incentive for them to really fundamentally change the way they're operating, particularly in an environment where typically they're funding a lot of these projects completely on their own. So in that sense, they can dictate requirements, whereas in the infrastructure space, it's a little bit different. And so, I think this needs to be an item on the reform agenda for it to really progress and to have that ministerial sponsorship that, yes, this is an area where we could see some improvements. Because the other thing that I would add too is that there's not necessarily, we haven't seen a lot of evidence of the benefits of the disparate policies that are in place at the moment. So there tends we're not aware of much evaluation of those employment estimates. You know, certainly from my experience in government, we know that those things is not often done with not necessarily a lot of science around the numbers themselves or validation of them. And so perhaps, you know, for jurisdictions, the actual impacts of, you know, maybe some redistribution of employment away from their own state may actually not be that significant, especially when you're considering the opportunities for, you know, reduced costs, growing the rail industry, so growing overall employment, and even, you know, export opportunities and that sort of stuff that you would get from a more vibrant national industry. So all of those things need to be considered.
Yeah. People have stopped being shy and I'm starting to receive some questions through, so that's great. So I'll kick off with this question. Was there much comment when you undertook your consultation on the quality of work done locally versus overseas? So did respondents think that the Australian built sort of rolling stock or construction and operated solution is of higher or lower quality?
I'm happy to have a go at that one. I think I might hand to Barry too, but I think there was certainly something that there was a lot of commentary on, a lot of anecdotal feedback, and there certainly were a lot of comments suggesting that, you know, that locally produced content can be significantly better in quality, but not always the case. Barry, do you want to add anything to that?
I think that's generally the case. I mean, I think what I think is seen is that you've got better control over quality on local manufacture. And I think that's been highlighted very recently with COVID, whereby a lot of overseas manufacture, people from Australia have found it very difficult to get there because of all the various rules and regulations, etc. And so I think a combination of that plus, yeah, the greater control and let's say responsibility, I suppose, on a local level, people perceive that, and I think it is, you know, there is certain evidence that local manufacture has a higher quality and a higher potential for quality.
And another question is that we're seeing increasingly as a subset of local content policy an emphasis on ATSI enterprises participating in government procurement generally and assessed as a tender requirement. Was this part of your analysis?
No, we're not. Wasn't something that came up in our analysis, admittedly, which was done a little while ago now. So, you know, be happy to get some further information on that and have a look at that further.
Yeah,
sure. Perhaps the question around how other industries or other countries are doing better or where we can learn from. So are there other sectors that we can get some lessons learned in terms of how we improve harmonisation?
Barry, I know you've had some views on this area from some of your other work. Did you want to comment on that?
Yeah. I mean, I think that for a start, I think we'd all agree there is a growing trend for local manufacture based on in a number of industries, providing greater harmonisation in delivery and long-term support of assets. And I think that's something we do need to look at the other industries. One example is the electric buses, where there's a number of states have started a coordination of looking at the harmonisation of standards and work towards a common standard and contract process for the design and delivery of electric buses across a number of the jurisdictions. And I think that, and my understanding is that that is progressing. It's progressing, and I think it's something that we need to sort of look at and keep an eye on, because and learn from what are the common aspects of that process that we could apply to the rail sector, and I guess specifically to rolling stock as a sort of an equivalent to that. And that to me is it's sort of it's something that I think we can. That's certainly one industry anyway where it's certainly happening, and I think that there's probably others that we need to sort of identify as well.
Perhaps given time, last question, what's sort of the top 1 or 2 challenges that we need to crack to make or break this delivery of a national local content policy?
Christine, did you want to answer that one?
Yeah, sure. I'd say the issue that I spoke about before regarding the political will, I think that's a huge issue, but there is the potential to overcome that. I think with looking at a broader perspective of what economic benefit is and how that can be shared throughout jurisdictions. And I'd say probably the other challenge is the federal involvement, and the two things probably do go together. Getting that federal buy-in to this idea that the economic benefits can be greater and can be shared, so that the jurisdictions can be kept happy and the overall pie can grow, so that the pieces of the pie can also grow. So I'd say that, yeah, those two things sort of work together to grow the pie, I guess. And probably another one that we've touched on briefly is the harmonisation and the application of standards. I think that's been talked about quite extensively in similar forums, but yeah, the more we spoke to stakeholders as part of this work, the more apparent that became how vital that was to help us get better local content.
Great, thanks Christine, and thanks all our presenters. I really hope today this presentation was really insightful for everyone that joined. The report towards a national local content is now available on the ARA's website, along with an accompanying fact sheet for you all to download. And I really trust that this research provides valuable understanding on the impacts and opportunities of local content policy and proves useful for formation in policy development and implementation. The ARA will be engaging with each of the jurisdictions to discuss the report's recommendations and request their consideration and willingness to partner constructively with other jurisdictions and the Australian rail supply chain to recognise the benefits for both procurers and rail suppliers in taking a more holistic national approach to the application of local content policy. As you mentioned before, Phil, with almost $14 billion in new rolling stock projects and $155 billion in broader rail projects, skyrocketing costs, tight labour market, now's the time to align procurement processes and policy to better support local rail suppliers and outcomes for taxpayers. Given time, I'm going to bring this webinar to a close. Again, thank you presenters and panellists for your contribution today. Thanks for those who participated and joined in the discussion online. Today's webinar is recorded, so you can access it on the ARA's website in the coming days. But on behalf of the ARA, I'd really like to thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.